Lunch in early 20th century America was not about choice. It was about survival, routine, and feeding working bodies with limited means. One forgotten recipe once carried this responsibility quietly, appearing on tables day after day without praise or record. This dish mattered because it solved a problem every household faced: how to turn simple ingredients into steady nourishment. Today, it has nearly vanished from memory, taking its story with it. If this recipe disappears entirely, we lose evidence of how ordinary families endured. To understand that world, we must begin with this humble lunch from the American working past. One of the most dependable lunches of early 20th century America was cornmeal mush. It appeared in farmhouses, mining towns, and mill villages where money was scarce and labor was constant. Cornmeal was inexpensive, shelf-stable, and widely available through local mills. Cooked slowly with water and salt, it produced a filling dish that could be prepared before dawn and reheated after hours of work. Cornmeal mush was eaten hot, sliced cold, or fried in a skillet, depending on time and fuel. It required no meat to satisfy hunger. Families understood its value because it stretched limited supplies without complaint. Children carried it to school. Workers ate it quickly before returning to fields or factories. The recipe rarely appeared in printed cookbooks because it was learned by watching, not reading. This dish tells the truth about American lunches before convenience foods arrived. Meals were shaped by necessity, not preference. Cornmeal mush endured because it was reliable. The next recipe reveals another midday solution born from thrift, habit, and regional knowledge, expanding this forgotten map of American lunch tables during the era. Boiled cabbage with potatoes was another common American lunch during the early 20th century. It was not celebrated, yet it appeared repeatedly in working homes where gardens and cellars determined the menu. Cabbage stored well through winter months, and potatoes provided dependable bulk. Together, they formed a meal that could be cooked in one pot and shared without waste. The vegetables were simmered slowly, often with a spoon of saved bacon drippings for flavor. Nothing was discarded. The cooking water was sometimes poured over bread or reused for supper. This lunch fed families during hard seasons when fresh food was limited and wages were uncertain. It was especially common among immigrant households who brought boiling traditions from Europe and adapted them to American conditions. This dish mattered because it reveals how lunches were planned around endurance, not pleasure. It kept workers full through long afternoons and required no special skill to prepare. For many families, this midday meal represented stability, routine, and quiet reassurance in uncertain times across rural towns and crowded industrial neighborhoods nationwide. The next recipe continues the story of forgotten lunches that once sustained ordinary American lives during an era defined by labor, thrift, and persistence alone. Another forgotten American lunch of the early 20th century was bread and milk. It was served in farm kitchens, boarding houses, and city tenements where budgets were tight and time was limited. Stale bread was never discarded. It was broken into pieces and soaked in warm milk, sometimes sweetened lightly, sometimes left plain. This meal required no stove when fuel was scarce and no meat when it was unavailable. Bread and milk mattered because it reflects how American households treated food as a resource, not a luxury. Bakeries sold day-old loaves at reduced prices, and families planned meals around their use. Milk came from backyard cows, local dairies, or delivery wagons that stopped daily on city streets. This lunch fed children, elderly relatives, and laborers who needed something quick but sustaining. The dish carried emotional weight as well as nourishment. It was associated with care, routine, and recovery during illness or exhaustion. Though simple, it provided comfort in homes shaped by long work hours and uncertain income. Its disappearance from memory hides how deeply frugality shaped everyday lunches. The next recipe reveals another practical meal that turned common pantry items into steady midday nourishment for working American families of the same era. A common lunch in early 20th century America was fried salt pork with onions. It appeared most often in rural homes and labor camps where preserved meat was essential. Salt pork was inexpensive, heavily cured, and designed to last for months without refrigeration. Sliced thin and fried slowly, it released fat that became the foundation of the meal. Onions were added to the pan because they were cheap, filling, and capable of softening the sharp saltiness of the meat. The combination was eaten with bread, boiled potatoes, or leftover vegetables. Nothing was wasted. The rendered fat was saved for future cooking, and even the smallest scraps were valued. This lunch provided energy for physically demanding work such as farming, logging, and railroad labor. Fried salt pork with onions mattered because it shows how preservation shaped American eating habits. Lunches were built around what could survive storage, transport, and time. Flavor came second to function. This meal was not indulgent, but it was dependable and sustaining. Its absence from modern tables erases an understanding of how working families relied on cured foods to endure long days. The next recipe continues this pattern, revealing another lunch shaped by preservation, thrift, and the realities of early American labor and household economy. A frequent American lunch in the early 20th century was dried bean soup. It was prepared in homes where money was limited and physical labor defined daily life. Dried beans were inexpensive, easy to store, and available year-round. They were soaked overnight, simmered slowly, and seasoned with salt, onions, or a small piece of preserved meat when available. This soup mattered because it could feed many people from a single pot. Families relied on it to stretch meals across several days. It was eaten at midday because it was filling and warming, especially during colder months. Workers returned to fields, factories, and workshops sustained by a meal that provided steady energy rather than comfort or variety. Bean soup reveals how early American lunches were planned with patience and foresight. Cooking took time, but ingredients were simple and predictable. Leftovers were expected, not avoided. The same pot might be reheated again the next morning or evening. This lunch reflects a culture that valued endurance over excitement and nourishment over appearance. As this dish fades from memory, it removes evidence of how households survived on preparation and restraint. The next recipe continues this record of lunches that sustained ordinary Americans through routine labor, limited resources, and long working days. Potato pancakes were a common American lunch in the early 20th century, especially in households shaped by immigration and seasonal hardship. Potatoes were inexpensive, widely grown, and stored easily through winter. Leftover boiled potatoes were grated or mashed, mixed with a small amount of flour and salt, then fried in a thin layer of saved fat. This method transformed leftovers into a sustaining midday meal. This lunch mattered because it reflects how American families avoided waste with intention. Nothing was thrown away if it could be reshaped into nourishment. Potato pancakes were quick to prepare and required only a hot pan and careful attention. They were eaten plain or with a spoon of applesauce, depending on availability and region. Children ate them at home. Workers ate them standing or wrapped for transport. Potato pancakes reveal how lunches were built from continuity, not novelty. The same ingredient appeared again and again in different forms, each shaped by timing and need. This dish carried knowledge passed through observation rather than instruction. It belonged to kitchens where skill was measured by resourcefulness, not presentation. As potato pancakes disappear from everyday memory, so does evidence of how early American lunches balanced economy and sustenance. The next recipe continues this exploration, revealing another forgotten midday meal that relied on leftovers, patience, and the quiet discipline of household survival. Chicken and dumplings were a practical lunch in early 20th century America, though they were far simpler than the versions served today. Leftover cooked chicken or freshly prepared poultry was simmered slowly with water or broth. Small dumplings, made from flour, water, and a pinch of salt, were dropped into the simmering pot. The resulting meal was hearty, filling, and able to feed multiple family members with minimal expense. This dish mattered because it demonstrates how households turned scarce protein into sustaining meals. Every part of the chicken was used, including bones for broth, which added flavor and nutrition. Dumplings stretched the meal, ensuring that small quantities of meat could provide enough nourishment for laboring adults and growing children alike. It required no specialized tools, only patience and attention to timing. Chicken and dumplings were more than sustenance. They were familiar and comforting. The aroma alone signaled midday relief and a brief pause from demanding work. Its simplicity reflected the priorities of early American lunches: thrift, nourishment, and reliability. As this recipe fades from memory, so too does the record of how families used ingenuity to feed themselves on limited means. The next lunch continues this story of forgotten meals, showing yet another way ordinary Americans transformed modest ingredients into satisfying, practical dishes that endured long before convenience became a standard. Fried mush cakes were a staple lunch in early 20th century American kitchens, particularly in rural homes where cornmeal was abundant. Cornmeal mush, once boiled and cooled, was sliced and pan-fried in a small amount of fat until golden brown. The result was a crisp exterior surrounding a soft, dense interior, providing a filling and inexpensive meal. This dish mattered because it extended the use of a single batch of cornmeal mush, ensuring that nothing went to waste. Families could prepare it in the morning and reheat it at midday, saving time and fuel for other tasks. Fried mush cakes were portable and versatile, eaten plain or accompanied by syrup, salt, or milk depending on what was available in the household. Its importance lies in how it demonstrates early American ingenuity in stretching ingredients. Laboring families relied on such practices to nourish children and adults alike during long workdays. Every slice of mush transformed into a satisfying meal, highlighting the value placed on thrift, routine, and sustenance rather than presentation or luxury. As fried mush cakes vanish from memory, they leave behind a quiet record of how households survived on simple, repeatable recipes. The next recipe continues the story, revealing yet another forgotten lunch that once fed ordinary Americans through practicality, patience, and resourceful cooking. Baked beans were a common lunch in early 20th century America, particularly in households that valued economy and preparation. Dried beans were soaked overnight, simmered slowly, and combined with molasses, salt pork, or bacon when available. The mixture was then baked for several hours, allowing flavors to meld and the beans to become tender and filling. This dish mattered because it transformed inexpensive, shelf-stable ingredients into a sustaining meal capable of feeding entire families. Baked beans were often prepared in advance, then reheated at midday, making them practical for busy households where labor and time were constant demands. Children carried portions to school, and adults returned to fields, factories, or workshops nourished by the protein and calories. Baked beans demonstrate how early American lunches were built around preservation, resourcefulness, and efficiency. Flavor was secondary to sustenance, yet the dish carried an unspoken warmth, providing familiarity and comfort across generations. It required no exotic ingredients or elaborate preparation, only attention and patience. As this recipe fades from modern tables, it erases evidence of a daily ritual that combined thrift, taste, and practicality. The next lunch continues this exploration of forgotten American meals, revealing how ordinary families relied on simple ingredients and careful planning to sustain themselves through long workdays and limited resources. Pot roast with root vegetables was a modest yet dependable lunch in early 20th century America. A small cut of beef, often tough and inexpensive, was slow-cooked in water or broth with potatoes, carrots, and onions. The long cooking process tenderized the meat while infusing the vegetables with flavor, creating a single pot of nourishing sustenance. This dish mattered because it maximized limited resources. One cut of meat could feed an entire family for multiple meals, and the vegetables added bulk and nutrition at minimal cost. Leftovers were reheated or transformed into new dishes, ensuring that nothing was wasted. This lunch reflected the priorities of American households: economy, practicality, and nourishment above all else. Pot roast with root vegetables also carried emotional significance. The aroma signaled a pause in the workday and a moment of shared sustenance. Children and laboring adults alike depended on its warmth and familiarity to sustain long hours of labor. As this recipe disappears from memory, so does the evidence of how American families constructed lunches around thrift, patience, and resourcefulness. It is part of a larger story of forgotten midday meals, each designed to sustain ordinary lives with minimal ingredients and maximum care. This concludes the exploration of 10 lost American lunches that once defined everyday tables across the nation.